Here we go. Guess I was wrong. Turns out you do know where you're going.
I sat on playing The Last of Us Part 2 for the longest time because of the simple fact that the first game was depressing as all hell. A deeply dour survival horror game set against the backdrop of a post-zombie apocalypse, Naughty Dog's wild departure from the rip-roaring, pulpy adventure of the Uncharted series was a lot to handle. Before Part 2's release, I thought about replaying the first game to get my bearings, but found that the prologue, in which we watch as the protagonist's daughter is killed during Outbreak Day, still makes me sad and uncomfortable. Having heard rumblings about Part 2 being even more dark and depressing than its predecessor, and the fact that we were experiencing our own pandemic, 2020 just didn't seem like the right time. Now that things are kinda sorta getting better, it seemed like a good time to revisit Naughty Dog's controversial Misery Simulator. And having played through it to completion, well, I have some thoughts. Part 2 sludges along a temporally meandering path, but the crux of the narrative occurs 5 years after Joel saved Ellie from the Fireflies, one of many militia groups that sprung up as a result of the Federal Disaster Response Agency's radical enforcement of quarantine zones amidst the fungal outbreak of 2013. Ellie developed a natural immunity to the virus, and the Fireflies believed they could make a cure by removing and studying a part of her brain at the expense of her life. This didn't sit well with Joel, having developed a father-like bond with Ellie throughout their journey across the country, prompting him to cut a bloody swath through the Fireflies and then lie about it to Ellie. In Part 2, we revisit Joel and Ellie, both older and estranged for a reason yet to be revealed, as they eke out a new world living in Jackson County, Wyoming, through a community that is safe, secure, and comfortable. The Last of Us is a harsh world of violent consequence, however, and Joel's decision in Part 1 comes back to haunt him through Abby, the daughter of the Firefly surgeon Joel killed. Abby and Ellie are painfully clear foils for one another, but share the same devotion towards violence as a means to an end. Part 2's extensive prologue is a slow burn that reintroduces Ellie and reveals the game's second playable protagonist, Abby. The two women's initial paths lead to Joel. For Ellie, she searches for him when it is reported that he didn't check in during patrol. Abby, on the other hand, reaches the end of a 5-month search literally by bumping into him while avoiding the infected. Abby and her companions, all revealed to be former Fireflies, confront Joel and force Ellie to watch as Abby unleashes a brutal and lethal attack on the older man. Bruised, bloodied, but alive, Ellie is left to lick her wounds and find meaning in a life without Joel. Inspired by his brother Tommy, she sneaks out of Jackson accompanied by a friend and romantic partner, Dina, to make the arduous journey to Seattle, Washington and confront Joel's killer. The game proper follows Ellie's adventures in the city across the span of 3 days, each fraught with life or death experiences at the hands of the Washington Liberation Front, the religiously minded Seraphites, and the infected. And just when Ellie's story reaches its climax as the two women face each other a second time, the story jumps back 3 days prior, with the player experiencing the same time frame, but from Abby's point of view. Both Abby and Ellie have their reasons for being in Seattle, and obstructing their paths are the overgrown ruins of a dead Seattle, with nary a working Starbucks in sight. As it did in Part 1, a lush post-apocalypse setting affords many opportunities to take in some incredible PlayStation 4 visuals. Naughty Dog has always been a pioneer in getting as much visual power from a Sony console, and the sequel is just as incredible to look at. The Last of Us favored many quiet, introspective moments with which to stare in awe and wonder over the ways in which the Earth heals itself, turning cities from proud testaments to human ingenuity into overgrown concrete jungles. Part 2 doubles down, making every effort to manipulate level design so that the player is all but forced to stop and soak up entire vistas worth of abandoned porn. The frequency of these "stop and smell the roses, damn it" moments was so high that it had me thinking that some folks at Naughty Dog were trying to one-up each other to create the most tragic, beautiful visuals. I'm not complaining too much, as Part 2's looks are easily the strongest element of the game, and clearly the studio's finest work to date. In the time since Outbreak Day, humanity has struggled to take its first crawl towards rebuilding society. By part 2, that crawl has grown into a wobbly step as people have learned to adapt to their new normal and establish sustainable and isolated communities. Ellie's Jackson County is depicted as one of the good ones because they are antithetical to the other factions depicted in the game. The Rattlers of California are barbaric slavers who delight in torturing humans for sport. Abby's Washington Liberation Front is a pro-military organization that led an organized armed revolt against Fedra and established law and order through harsh punishments and strict rules. And yet, when we see the WLF headquarters through Abby's eyes, it has the appearance of a functioning society for citizens of all ages. Then there are the Seraphites, a spiritual group widely considered to be a kooky religious cult by any and all outsiders. While the game still has plenty of encounters with the cordyceps up its sleeve, the player finds themselves antagonized by each of these factions and must deal with them accordingly. Combat in The Last of Us is balanced towards stealth, and Part 2 feels largely unchanged with the exception of new mechanics and environmental features that let the player stay on the move while remaining hidden from view. Face-to-face engagements are always an option, but given the overall weakness of the player character, the scarcity of ammo, and the higher number of enemies on the field, means it's often better to trick and trap them than engage in Uncharted-style gunfights. Using cover, you'll advance on the enemy by grabbing them from behind, pick them off with silent weapons, and use noise-making items to break patrol patterns and lure them into quiet murder corners. Human enemies have a measure of unpredictability in open combat, and the AI will attempt to flank you during gun battles and also react aggressively if they hear the click of your empty gun, which is actually pretty cool. The enemy also makes use of dogs that can track the player's scent, and while I appreciate that they were designed to keep the player moving and on their toes, I find their inclusion to be grossly distasteful because you have to kill them, and doing so is never pleasant. Using the listen command allows you to better plan your attacks as it reveals enemy locations and your scent when dogs are around, but it is not as effective as it was in the first game. Close-up enemies have great clarity, but others at a distance are far more difficult to discern. Humans can be unpredictable, but the cordyceps sing a familiar tune. These zombified humans run on aggression and, depending on what stage of the infection they've adapted to, present unique challenges. Runners are the most common creatures to encounter and are sensitive to sight and sound. Stay in their field of vision for too long and they'll come running. The most unnerving creature in any video game, clickers are blind monsters that react to sound and are capable of instantly killing the player when caught. They were terrifying in the first game, and they still are now. New to Part 2 are Stalkers, creatures that hide in fungal mounds and don't appear in listen view, a higher concentration of bloaters, and a bloater variant called Shamblers that can inflict serious damage. For the better part of the game, you'll face off against humans and the infected by themselves, but there are special occasions where you'll meet up with both and have the ability to create some real chaos. Tossing a Molotov at a clicker or runner to trigger a madcap feeding frenzy that'll get both sides attacking each other is a pure delight. The crafting system from Part 1 returns and is also largely unchanged. You're free to construct weapons and gear on the fly by picking up an assortment of everyday items and crafting them together. Using Ellie and Abby's backpack, you can construct old favorites like Molotovs, shivs, and silencers, as well as new goodies like pipe bombs, special ammo, and explosive traps that provide additional and engaging options for killing people and infected alike. Guns can be upgraded by collecting spare parts and using a workbench to improve their stability and fire rate, as well as to add enhancements like scopes and increased damage output. Collecting vitamin pills also lets you unlock character upgrades across multiple skill trees that can increase health, yield more powerful crafted weapons, improve melee weapon stability, and increase your effectiveness in stealth engagements. You won't find enough vitamins in a single playthrough to max out the entire skill tree for each character, so I tried to focus on particular avenues that would suit the character. For Ellie, I put more towards stealth and crafting, while for Abby, I focused on combat perks since she has a more aggressive playstyle, though I thought it's stupid that she has to craft shivs to use on clickers. She's a soldier. She should have a knife. Pipe bombs, larger combat arenas, and new enemy types are nice, but they don't solve the fundamental problem associated with The Last of Us Part 2's combat. It gets incredibly tedious over time. Part 2 is a roughly 25-hour adventure, and despite these encounters taking place in many different environments, it all ends up being the same song and dance each time as you lure targets into vulnerable positions. The addition of the tracking dogs does add agency to stealth sequences, but they are used sparingly and, in my case, are hard to take out quietly, so I pretty much treated these situations as a chance to go loud and use up all the ammo I had been saving up. There are certain story sequences where the only option is to run around guns blazing, and they expose the shortcomings of a game that doesn't have a strong emphasis on gunplay. Melee combat, on the other hand, works well and feels visceral whether you're slugging it out with fists or smacking the side of someone's head with a baseball bat with glass shards taped to it. My biggest beef with combat is how it contributes to The Last of Us Part 2's overall problem with pacing. The story is a bit of a mess, a loose collection of flashbacks, callbacks, POV switching, and interactive sequences that desperately needed to be reined in. Ellie and Abby's experiences in Seattle clock in at about 12 hours each, and instead of intertwining them, they are presented as their own contained stories. At the start of each day, both characters experience prolonged flashbacks that show their lives before they were affected by each other. For Ellie, it's about coming to terms with what Joel did at the end of Part 1. For Abby, she struggles with the trauma of seeing her father killed and trying to track down the one who did it. These flashbacks grow more inconvenient over time because they tend to trigger after a major story event, and interruptions like these didn't sit well with me because I wanted to see what happens next. The Last of Us Part 2's story is truly compelling, and it's maddening that Naughty Dog put so many obstructions in its way. I won't say that these moments are not needed. They're essential in helping the player better understand both characters, but there has to be a better method of delivery. Like, I don't know, play through each character's day back to back with each other instead. Or, I dare suggest, build the game's story around one character for the entire duration. And, naturally, that character should be Abby. Abby's story has the best narrative and character arc, and as such, the entire sequel should have been about her. I vividly recall the ugly backlash to Abby and what she did to Joel when Part 2's story was leaked ahead of the game's release. So I was braced for a character so contemptuously evil that she drove people to send death threats to her voice actress Laura Bailey. I have to admit though that I liked Abby from the start. Like a lot of other people in the game, she's damaged. Affected by the loss of her father and the collapse of the Fireflies, she's grown up with a hard edge as she meticulously follows leads and clues to Joel's whereabouts. And when the deed is done, justified in her mind, she is wholly unprepared for the fallout that is to come as Ellie picks her friends off one by one. Abby's encounters with the Seraphites in Seattle sets her down a new life path and understanding towards the people she regularly antagonized, changing her once rock-solid tunnel vision worldview. Granted, her tune changes fairly quickly, but the fact remains that she changes. So much so that when she is confronted by Ellie again while at her most vulnerable, she resists the call to fight as much as possible. The Last of Us Part 2 shows what happens to people when they commit themselves to violence. Abby learned to walk away, and Ellie was on her way to learning this lesson as well, until she was overwhelmed by her own grief for Joel and Tommy's repulsive guilt trip that sets her on a path to become a hopeless, broken mess. The Last of Us Part 2 is a complex thing to talk about. As a video game, it does a fine job of marrying the first game's mechanics with new scenarios and tools in an environment that is bigger and more dangerous than before. From a story perspective, I felt like Naughty Dog tried to do too much. The flow and pacing of the story would have benefited by focusing on one character, and given the level of depth afforded to her, it is clear that Abby's story has the most substance, drama, and character-defining moments. Ellie's singular goal doesn't make her look very good, and yes, I get it, hatred and revenge has that effect on people. But when you hold both women's adventures in a mirror, it is clear that Abby has the far more interesting story to tell. If you're a fan of dour, misery-laden stories where the main characters are put through a lot of death and suffering, then The Last of Us Part 2 is an enticing package. Just be mindful of the frequency with which Naughty Dog overindulges in oft heavy-handed storytelling and direction.
Wow.
Yeah.
See that? Told you they were spotted.
Yeah.
You want me to slow down?
No.
Is it this? It's this, isn't it? You are disgusted by it. Come on, Ab.
I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry. Talk to me.
I know all the leads have dried up, but Joel's still out there, you know?
I know. What can I do?
Let's go back. We can still make training.